Have you ever felt the ground vanish beneath your feet? Like everything you trusted, everything that gave you a sense of safety, was ripped away in an instant? Imagine waking up one day to find that the only place you ever called home, the house filled with your happiest childhood memories, was sold behind your back. Not by a stranger, not by a thief, but by your own family. Welcome to AGS Stories, where true stories of betrayal, resilience, and justice are brought to life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me. My name is Lily, and this is my story. I was 26, living in Columbus, Ohio. Life wasn't perfect, but I had built something for myself. I worked hard, paid my bills, and had carved out a small corner of stability in a world that often felt unpredictable. But there was one thing, one place, that gave me a kind of comfort nothing else could: my grandfather's house. That house was more than just a property. It was the heartbeat of my childhood. Summers spent chasing fireflies in the backyard. Evenings sitting on the porch, listening to Grandpa tell stories about his younger days. And during the worst times, when my parents were screaming at each other, or when my little brother Josh was getting into trouble, that house was my escape. It was where I felt safe, loved, seen. When Grandpa passed away, he left that house to me. I wasn't surprised. Grandpa knew. He saw the truth, that while my father, David, and my brother, Josh, treated him like an afterthought, I was the one who showed up. I was the one who cared. I thought the house was mine. I thought it was untouchable. But I was wrong. One afternoon, I decided to drive by the house just to check in. I hadn't moved in yet. I had my own place in the city, but knowing it was there gave me peace. As I turned onto the familiar street, something felt off. A moving truck sat in the driveway. Strangers were carrying boxes inside. My heart raced as I parked and stepped out, my palms sweating. A man, maybe in his 40s, appeared at the door. His wife was behind him, holding a potted plant, the kind of thing you bring when you're settling into a new home. "Can I help you?" he asked. This is my house," I said, my voice trembling. The woman exchanged a look with her husband. She gave an awkward smile, like she was trying to be polite, but also didn't want to deal with a crazy person. "We bought this house last month," the man said, "from the previous owner." I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My vision blurred. "That's not possible," I whispered. But it was. The keys dangling from his hand. The moving truck packed with their belongings. This was their house now. I stumbled back to my car, barely able to breathe. I checked my phone, scrolling through emails, messages, anything that would tell me this was some kind of mistake. But there was nothing. No alerts, no notifications, just a suffocating silence. I drove straight to my parents' house, my heart pounding harder with each mile. When I stormed through the door, Josh was sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. He barely looked up. "What's up?" he mumbled. I could hardly get the words out. "They sold Grandpa's house." Josh blinked. "Oh, that? As if it was nothing, as if my world hadn't just collapsed. That was the moment I realized the people I trusted the most had betrayed me, and they had no idea what was coming next. I sat in my car for what felt like hours after leaving the house that was no longer mine. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. My chest was heavy, as if a boulder had settled on it, pressing down with every shallow breath I took. The image of the couple standing in the doorway, their confused but slightly defensive expressions, was burned into my mind. The moving truck, the unfamiliar car in the driveway, the potted plant in her hands, something so simple, yet it signaled permanence. They were moving in. They had made my home their home. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I swallowed them down. There was no room for tears now. I needed answers. I started my car and drove straight to my parents' house, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I walked in, Josh was there, slouched on the couch like he always was, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my existence. "They sold Grandpa's house," I said, my voice trembling, hoping, praying that somehow this was a misunderstanding. Josh didn't even look up. "Oh, that," he muttered, like it was an afterthought. Like it was nothing. My blood boiled. "Where's Dad?" I demanded. He shrugged, still not meeting my gaze. Ow! He'll be back later. I stood there staring at him, waiting for him to say something, anything to show me that he understood what this meant to me. But he didn't. He just went back to his phone like my entire world hadn't just collapsed. I felt my heart crack a little more. When my parents finally came home, I confronted my father the second he walked through the door. My voice was shaking, but my words were sharp. What did you do? He sighed like I was being difficult. Lily, it wasn't fair for you to have that house all to yourself. We needed it. Josh needed help. Help with what? Sitting on the couch all day. I snapped. My mother flinched, but my father remained calm, almost condescending. He's under a lot of stress. He needed a fresh start. We needed money to support him. My heart raced. So, you forged my signature? You sold Grandpa's house. The only thing he left me. So Josh could what? Continue being coddled? My father crossed his arms. It was an investment. You don't understand. But I did understand. He wasn't telling me everything, but I knew. I saw the guilt flicker in his eyes, the brief hesitation before every sentence. I knew my father. He didn't sell that house for Josh. He sold it for himself. Later that night, I dug deeper. I combed through bank statements and documents that I managed to retrieve from his desk. What I found made my blood run cold. There was no investment. The money was gone, lost in gambling debts. Thousands of dollars poured into casinos and online betting. And the rest? Spent on hotels, expensive dinners, and jewelry for a woman who was not my mother. My father had not only stolen my inheritance, he had gambled away my grandfather's legacy. He had betrayed me. He had betrayed our family. I confronted him the next morning. This time, I was not shaking. You didn't sell that house for Josh, I said coldly. You sold it because you were drowning in debt, and you forged my signature to do it. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. I did what I had to do. Those 6 words shattered whatever was left of my heart. I turned to my mother. Did you know? Her face was pale. Your father said it was best for the family. Best for the family. That was always their excuse. Everything for Josh. Everything for Dad. Never for me. I looked at Josh. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He had known to. Maybe not the full extent, but enough. Enough to know that the house I loved, the house that represented everything good in my childhood, was sold to cover my father's debts and fund his own comfort. I felt like a stranger in my own family. They had all been complicit. They had all chosen each other over me. Again, I left that house, but the rage followed me. It pulsed in my veins, hot and consuming. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. Grandpa's voice echoed in my mind, his laughter, his advice, his warmth. He had trusted me with that house because he knew I would honor it. And I had failed him. Or had I? I realized something then. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to be the forgotten daughter any longer. They had underestimated me. They thought I would cry, that I would accept it, that I would let them get away with it. They were wrong. The next day, I made 2 calls. The first was to my lawyer, Daniel, sharp, relentless, and someone who knew how to tear people like my father apart in a courtroom. The second was to a private investigator. If there was dirt to be found on my father and his mistress, I wanted it. As the pieces started coming together, I uncovered more than I had ever imagined. The gambling debts were worse than I thought. My father owed money to men who didn't ask twice. The kind of men who would break your legs or burn down your house if you didn't pay up. And his mistress? She wasn't just some fling. She had a history of conning older men out of their savings. My father had risked everything, his freedom, his family, for this woman. And when that wasn't enough, he had stolen from me. I stood in Daniel's office as he laid out our case. Forgery, fraud, theft. Your father is looking at prison time. Part of me hesitated. This was my father. Could I really send him to prison? Then I thought of Grandpa's house. I thought of that couple unpacking their belongings into my home. I thought of my father's smirk, Josh's indifference, my mother's excuses. Yes, I could, but I want to ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you fight for justice, no matter the cost? Or would you forgive and try to move on? Comment 111 if you want me to make my father pay for what he did. Comment 222 if you think I should let it go, because I had made my choice. And once the wheels of justice started turning, there would be no going back. The weight of betrayal settled deep into my chest as I sat alone in my apartment that night. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's house. Our house, being invaded by strangers, their voices echoing through the walls that had once held my happiest memories. I heard my father's dismissive tone when I confronted him, his words dripping with condescension, as though I was nothing more than a petulant child. I saw Josh's blank face, barely looking up from his phone, as if my devastation was just another inconvenience to him. My family, the people who were supposed to protect me, had conspired to rob me of the one thing that mattered most. I couldn't let this go. I wouldn't. I spent hours combing through bank statements, legal documents, and emails, anything I could get my hands on. What I found was worse than I had imagined. My father, David, had been drowning in debt for years. Gambling, poker nights with friends that bled into weekends at the casino, online betting spirals that left his bank account gutted. It wasn't just casual. It was an addiction. He had borrowed from anyone who would lend, and when those well ran dry, he turned to people who operated outside the rules. Men who didn't just send reminders when you were late on a payment. They sent threats. They shattered windows. They waited outside your job. The house, my house, had been his last resort. He hadn't sold it because of a business opportunity. He had sold it because those men were closing in. And my brother Josh had known. He may not have been there at the casino tables, but he had enjoyed the spoils. When the sale was finalized, my father had used some of the money to cover his debts. The rest? Josh had taken his share. A new gaming setup. A trip to Miami with friends. He hadn't cared where the money came from, as long as he got his cut. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was the forgery. My signature scrawled on the sale documents. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I knew my handwriting. I had signed dozens of papers for work, for leases, for contracts. This was not mine. It was a cheap imitation, but legally it had passed. They had mocked my trust. My father, the man who once held my hand when I was scared of thunderstorms, had turned my name into a tool to cover his sins. The anger burned hot in my veins, but beneath it was grief. I grieved not only for the house, but for the family I thought I had. That illusion had shattered. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. I called Daniel the next morning. He was an old friend from college and had built a reputation as one of the toughest real estate and fraud attorneys in Ohio. If anyone could untangle this mess, it was him. Forgery? Fraud? This is serious, Lily, he said after I laid everything out. Your father's looking at jail time. You ready for that? I hesitated. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about revenge. This was about justice. And maybe, just maybe, it was about showing them that I wouldn't be the forgotten daughter anymore. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Daniel got to work immediately. He pulled property records, traced the bank transfers, and contacted the notary who had witnessed the sale. What he found was a gold mine. The notary had a history, an ongoing investigation into falsifying signatures for cash under the table. My father had been sloppy. He thought I would never look. He thought I would cry, scream, then disappear. He didn't expect me to fight. But the more we dug, the darker it became. The men my father owed were not your average loan sharks. These were men who made examples out of people. They didn't just take your money. They took your peace, your security. I started noticing strange cars parked near my apartment. I got anonymous calls, heavy breathing, silence, then a click. One night, I found my car with the tires slashed. You need to be careful, Lily, Daniel warned. This isn't just a legal battle anymore. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. They had already taken everything from me. All I had left was my anger, and I was ready to use it. I confronted my father one last time. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood there calm, unflinching, as I told him exactly what was coming. I know everything. The debts, the mistress, the forgery. I'm taking you to court, and if you can't pay, they will come for you. Not me. His face turned pale. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not concern for me. Concern for himself. You wouldn't do that, he whispered. I leaned in. Watch me. Josh tried to play innocent when I cornered him later that day. He stumbled over excuses. I didn't know it was that bad. Dad said it was no big deal, but I cut him off. You spent the money, Josh. You didn't ask questions because you didn't care. You were just as guilty. He had nothing to say to that. He knew it was true. I left their house with my head held high, but my heart was racing. I had declared war on my own family. There was no turning back. Daniel filed the lawsuit the next morning. Fraud, forgery, illegal sale of property. The demand was clear. Either they returned the $250,000 from the sale, or we would take them to court. And if they lost, we would seize their assets, their home, their savings, everything. The phone calls began almost immediately. My mother begged, "Please, Lily, we're family." My father raged, "You're destroying us over a house." Josh was silent. He knew better, but it was too late. They had destroyed me first. The trial date was set. My father's lawyer tried to delay it, but Daniel was relentless. The evidence was airtight. Bank transfers traced directly to casino accounts. Text messages from my father discussing the sale. The notary, now facing charges of his own, confessed to the forgery. I sat across from my father in court. He looked smaller somehow, his suit loose on his frame, his face lined with stress. Josh sat behind him, his face pale. My mother refused to meet my eyes. I told the jury everything. About my grandfather, about the house, about the betrayal. When the verdict was read, guilty, my father's head dropped. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The house was long gone, but I was awarded $250,000 in damages. Josh walked away with nothing. As I left the courthouse, my father called after me. His voice was broken. "Lily, please." I didn't stop. I didn't look back. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the check for $250,000 in my hand. It would never bring back my grandfather's house. It would never repair the hole in my heart. But it was justice, and it was mine. But I want to ask you, what would you have done? Would you have taken your own family to court, knowing it could destroy them? Or would you have forgiven them and tried to move on? If you agree with what I did, comment 111. If you think you would have handled it differently, tell me your thoughts below. Because sometimes the hardest battles we fight are with the people who should have loved us most. And sometimes the only way to win is to walk away and never look back. The threat started almost immediately after Daniel filed the lawsuit. At first, they were subtle, unsettling, but easy to dismiss if you wanted to convince yourself that nothing was wrong. Anonymous calls that hung up as soon as I answered. A car idling across the street for hours, the driver hidden behind dark, tinted windows. Footsteps behind me when I left work, quickening when I did, only to disappear the second I turned around. But then it escalated. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. It was 2:37 a.m. I answered without thinking. Breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. I froze, the kind of stillness that only comes when your body is trying to decide between fight or flight. I whispered, "Who is this?" The breathing stopped. A low, gravelly voice finally spoke. "Tell your father, pay up, or someone in your family is going to pay the price." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, phone still pressed to my ear, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a warning, a promise. They didn't care that I was his daughter. To them, I was leverage. I was a pawn. I should have been scared. I was. But more than that, I was angry, furious. They thought they could scare me into dropping this? They thought I would run? They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next day, I told Daniel about the call. He was concerned but not surprised. These guys, loan sharks, enforcers, they operate on fear. They want you to feel small, like you have no choice but to back down. What do? We don't back down, he said firmly. But, Lily, you need to be careful. Careful didn't even begin to cover it. 2 nights later, I left work late. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by a few flickering streetlights. I was halfway to my car when I noticed the shattered glass on the pavement. My car window smashed in. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. A piece of paper was tucked under the wiper, scrawled in thick black marker. Last warning. Then from the shadows, a voice, low, menacing. You tell him, time's up. I spun around, but I couldn't see anyone. Just the dark. Just the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. My hands shook as I called Daniel. He told me to report it to the police, which I did, but I knew they wouldn't do much. They took the report, nodded sympathetically, but we both knew I was just another name in their file. When I got home, I sat on my couch, staring at the wall. My father had dragged me into his mess, and now, these men, these dangerous men, thought I was part of it. I had every reason to walk away, to drop the case, to let my father clean up his own disaster. But I wouldn't. I thought about Grandpa. That house was his legacy, his gift to me. My father had already taken it. I wouldn't let him take my dignity too. The next morning, Daniel pushed forward harder than ever. He subpoenaed bank records, phone logs, everything. The evidence was damning. My father had forged my signature, laundered the money through several accounts, and used it to pay off a fraction of his gambling debts. The rest? Lavish weekends in Vegas, hotel suites, dinners with his mistress, and gifts, watches, jewelry, things he had never bought for my mother in their 30 years together. Josh, he had been paid off too. A few thousand here and there, enough to keep him quiet, enough to buy his silence. I confronted my brother one last time. You knew, I said. My voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it, sharp, dangerous. He looked guilty, but not enough. Dad said he'd handle it. He said you'd understand. I laughed, cold, bitter. Understand? You helped him destroy everything Grandpa left me. You took money from a fraud and thought I'd just... Understand? Josh had nothing to say. He knew he was caught. The trial moved quickly. Daniel was relentless, tearing through every defense my father's lawyer tried to put up. When the forged documents were presented in court, my father's face drained of color. The notary, already under investigation, testified against him. Everything unraveled. But the real moment, the one that stuck with me, was when I took the stand. I told the jury about Grandpa, about the summers in that house, about how it was the only place I had ever felt safe. I told them about the day I drove up and saw strangers moving in, how I had stood there, feeling like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. I looked at my father as I spoke. His eyes didn't meet mine. For the first time in my life, I saw him for what he truly was, a weak man, a liar, a coward. The verdict came back, guilty. For years in prison, the judge's words echoed in my ears, but I barely heard them. All I felt was relief, justice. My father, this man who had stolen from me, who had put me in danger, was finally facing the consequences. Josh was left with nothing. My mother? She sat there in silence as her husband was led away. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak to me. When it was over, I walked out of that courthouse alone. But I felt stronger than I ever had before. I had fought, and I had won. But I want to ask you, what do you think? Did my father and brother get what they deserved? Should the punishment have been even harsher for what they did? Comment 111 if you think they got what was coming to them, or if you believe they deserved even more. Or let me know what you would have done differently. Because for me, this wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about reclaiming my place. And no one, no matter how close, would ever take that from me again. The day of the trial arrived like a storm cloud I had seen coming from miles away. Inevitable, heavy, and suffocating. I woke up with a knot in my stomach, but my resolve was stronger than ever. There was no turning back now. Everything I had fought for, all the pain I had endured, led to this moment. Today, the truth would be laid bare. Today, justice would be served. As I walked into the courtroom, the air was cold and tense, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and made you second-guess your strength. But I forced my shoulders back and held my head high. I needed to be strong, not just for myself, but for my grandfather, for the memory of the man who had given me that house, who had given me love when no one else did. This was for him. I scanned the room and saw my father sitting at the defendant's table. For the first time in my life, he looked small. The arrogance, the dominance he had always exuded, it was gone. His suit hung loosely on his frame, his face lined with stress and sleepless nights. His eyes, once sharp with control, now darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Next to him was my brother Josh. He sat hunched over, eyes glued to the floor, as though looking up would somehow expose him to more shame. He looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except this was no trivial mistake. This was betrayal, theft, fraud. He had chosen his comfort over my future, over the one place that had ever truly felt like home. I took my seat beside Daniel, my lawyer and my shield in this war. His presence was steady and unwavering. He gave me a brief nod, and I knew we were ready. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Formalities were exchanged, but my mind raced ahead to the inevitable confrontation. My father's attorney tried his best to paint my father as a man who had simply made a mistake, a desperate father trying to provide for his family, who had fallen victim to bad judgment. He spoke of unity, of family bonds, urging the court to view this as a private matter that should never have seen the inside of a courtroom. But Daniel was relentless. He stood with a calm authority that commanded attention. He began by presenting the documents, the forged signature, a crude imitation of my handwriting that now symbolized the fracture of trust. The notary, who had facilitated the fraudulent sale, testified next. He was already under investigation for his role in other scams, and his confession sealed the authenticity of our claims. He admitted to accepting a bribe from my father, falsifying my signature without a second thought. Then came the financial records, pages upon pages of gambling transactions, bank withdrawals lining up perfectly with casino visits, credit card statements showing lavish dinners, hotel stays, and jewelry purchases for a woman who wasn't my mother. Each piece of evidence was a blade, cutting away at the false facade my father had built over the years. I felt his eyes on me as each document was displayed. There was no anger left in his gaze, only fear. He knew this was more than just money now. This was his freedom on the line. And then it was my turn. I was called to the witness stand. My throat tightened, but I took a deep breath. I needed them to hear me, not just the judge, not just the jury, but my father, my brother, my mother, wherever she was hiding in her shame. They needed to know what they had taken from me. I spoke about my grandfather, how he had been my sanctuary when my parents were too busy fighting, when Josh was being coddled and celebrated while I was ignored. I described the summers we spent together, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the backyard, the sound of his laughter as we played cards on the porch. That house was not just a property. It was the heart of every good memory I had. It was where I felt safe, where I felt loved. And they had ripped it away from me for greed, for selfishness, for lies. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. I told them about the day I pulled up to the driveway and saw strangers moving in, how I had stood there, frozen, feeling like my world had collapsed. The humiliation of finding out that the people I trusted most, my family, had sold my home behind my back. The fear when the threats started coming, when men my father owed money to shatter my car window, warning me that someone would pay if he didn't. When I looked at the jury, I saw empathy in their eyes. They understood. They felt my loss. But I turned to my father, and all I saw was emptiness. No apology, no regret. Just a man who had finally realized he was out of moves. The closing arguments were brief. The evidence was overwhelming. My father had forged documents, stolen from his daughter, gambled away his family's future, and endangered my safety. The verdict felt inevitable, but when the judge read it aloud, it still hit like a tidal wave. Guilty. My father was sentenced to 4 years in prison. For years to sit in a cell and think about the daughter he had betrayed. For years to reflect on the legacy of a father and grandfather he had tarnished. Josh was left with nothing. He had burned his bridge with me, and my parents' financial ruin left him adrift. His silence, his complicity, had cost him not just money, but his sister. We would never be the same again. The men who had threatened me, the debt collectors, the enforcers, moved on. Once it became clear that my father had nothing left to give, they turned their attention elsewhere. I was no longer their target. I was free. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no joy. How could there be? This was my father. This was my brother. the people who were supposed to love me. But there was relief because justice had been done, because I had fought back and reclaimed my dignity, because they would never take from me again. I want to ask you, do you think my father and brother got what they deserved? Or should their punishment have been even harsher for what they did? Comment 111 if you think justice was served, or even if you believe they deserve more. Or let me know your thoughts below, because sometimes the hardest battles we face are the ones against those we call family. And sometimes winning means walking away forever. 2 years later, I stood once again at the edge of the driveway that had once been mine, once been ours. The sun was setting over the small town in Ohio where my life had unraveled and slowly been stitched back together. The sky was painted with warm oranges and pinks, casting a soft glow over the house. My house, Grandpa's house. After everything, after the lies, the betrayal, the trial, I had finally bought it back. I gripped the keys tightly in my hand, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and grief. This was the moment I had dreamed about on the nights I couldn't sleep, the nights when I lay awake questioning if I had done the right thing. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my feet, just like it always had when I was a little girl. That familiar sound nearly brought tears to my eyes. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The air smelled the same, faintly of pine and freshly cut grass. And for a brief, beautiful moment, I heard him, Grandpa. His voice, gentle and full of pride, whispered in my mind. "You did good, Lily." My chest tightened, but it wasn't from pain this time. It was peace. The journey to this point had not been easy. After my father was sentenced to 4 years for fraud, everything changed. My mother, devastated and ashamed, avoided me for months. She blamed me, at first, blamed me for tearing the family apart, for exposing what could have been handled quietly. But over time, her anger softened. She saw that it wasn't me who had shattered our family. It was the lies, the deception, the gambling, the debts. My father's choices had been the wrecking ball. I had simply refused to be buried under the rubble. A year into his sentence, my father wrote me a letter. The first real apology I had ever received from him. It wasn't perfect. He was still proud, still stubborn, but it was honest. He admitted his mistakes. He told me that sitting in that cell had given him nothing but time to reflect on what he had done. To me, to Grandpa's memory, to our family. He wrote that he missed me, that he wished he could take it all back. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness is not something that comes easily when trust has been shattered. But I thought about Grandpa. He always taught me that people can change if they want to, and I wanted to believe my father could too. When I finally wrote him back, I told him the truth, that what he had done had hurt me more deeply than he could ever understand, that I had fought so hard not because of money, but because that house was the last piece of Grandpa I had left. But I also told him I was willing to try, to rebuild slowly, on my terms. My brother Josh was another story. After the trial, he spiraled. Without our parents to cushion him, he was forced to face the reality he had been avoiding for years. He struggled. He lost jobs. He drank too much. There were months when I didn't hear from him at all. I worried, but I knew I couldn't save him. He had to want to save himself. Then, a few months ago, he called me out of the blue. His voice was shaky, but there was a sincerity I hadn't heard in years. He told me he had gotten help, therapy, a steady job. He was trying to put his life together. He wanted to see me. That first meeting was awkward. We sat across from each other in a small diner, fidgeting with our coffee cups. But for the first time, we were honest. He admitted that he had been jealous when Grandpa left the house to me. He had always felt like he was supposed to be the favorite, the golden child. And when that didn't happen, it shattered his image of himself. He had clung to my father's approval because it was all he had left. I listened. I told him how forgotten I had felt growing up, how that house had been the only place I felt truly seen. By the end of our conversation, there were tears, but there was also hope. We agreed to take it slow, to rebuild, not as the siblings we had been, but as the adults we had become. My mother joined us for lunch the following week. It was the first time we had all sat together in nearly 2 years. The conversation was light, surface level, but it was something, a beginning. As for my father, he still had time left to serve, but I visited him last month. Seeing him through that glass, older and more fragile than I remembered, was painful. But we talked, really talked. And when he asked if I could ever forgive him, I told him that I was trying. I told him that I wanted us to be a family again, different, but maybe better. Standing there on the porch that day, those memories swirled in my mind. The pain, the anger, the loss, but also the growth, the forgiveness, the hope. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of dust, but beneath there was something familiar. A warmth, a sense of belonging. I ran my fingers along the wooden banister Grandpa had built with his own hands. It had new scratches now, marks left by the previous owners, but I didn't mind. The house had been lived in. It had endured, just like me. I walked through the living room where Grandpa and I used to play cards. I stood by the window where we watched summer thunderstorms roll in. I stepped into the kitchen where he taught me how to make his famous pancakes. Every corner of the house held a piece of him, a piece of me. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set over the trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. I had lost so much, but I had also gained something. Strength, clarity, a deeper understanding of what family really means. Family is not about perfection. It's about forgiveness. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, my family is still healing. We are not what we once were, but maybe that's a good thing. We are something new, something honest. I know some people might think I was too forgiving. Others might say I should have cut them off forever. And I understand that. Every situation is different. Every heart heals in its own way. But I want to ask you, what would you have done? Could you forgive someone who betrayed you like that? Or would you have walked away for good? Comment 111 if you believe forgiveness can lead to healing, or let me know your thoughts below. Because in the end, I got back more than just a house. I got back my family, and I found myself along the way. As I sat there on that porch, with the sun dipping below the horizon and the gentle breeze carrying the faintest whisper of Grandpa's voice, I realized something profound. This journey had not only brought me back to this house, it had brought me back to myself. It had shown me the strength I never knew I had, the resilience I didn't think I was capable of, and most importantly, it had reminded me that even in the face of betrayal, healing is possible. But my story is just one among countless others. Betrayal, especially from family, is a pain that cuts deeper than most wounds. Maybe you felt it too. Maybe you've stood where I stood, angry, broken, wondering if you would ever feel whole again. If you have, know this, you are not alone. You are stronger than you think. And you deserve to take back what is yours, whether it's your home, your dignity, or simply your peace. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Someone you loved? Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your voice matters. And if my story resonated with you, if it made you feel even a little less alone, please consider subscribing to AGS Stories and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us continue to tell these stories, stories of resilience, justice, and the strength to reclaim what's been taken. Because sometimes the only way to find peace is to fight for it. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply taking back what was always yours. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.